It's quite complicated, but again, it's quite simple. So this is looking at essentially the circuitry within a cell. Yeah, and you'll see a number of receptors on the cell edge, things like transforming growth factor beta on the top right hand side. On the left hand side we have a number of growth receptors.
Yeah.
And on the bottom right hand side we have basically a death receptor. Now what happens in cancer is these controls, or these growth and death controls essentially fail, and it can take many mutations in the cancer cell for a normal cell to become cancerous.
So it's progressive.
It's progressive, yeah, and this can take many years, which is one of the reasons why cancer is a disease of aging. But basically, in order for a cancerous cell to become cancerous, it has to learn to either ignore or
accept,
get around these controls. For instance, certain cancers can become self-sufficient in terms of growth signals, so they grow even though the environmental stimulus to do so isn't there. And they also learn to ignore a very important receptor called transforming growth factor beta, which is basically a stop receptor which stops the cells from growing. Now there's also a defensive mechanism as well, which is if the environment recognises that the cancerous cell has become cancerous, there's a sensor which can be used to basically trigger cell death and tell the cell to self-destruct.
Right.
And cancers start to ignore this as well. Yeah, so there are lots of things that have to go wrong in order for a normal cell to become cancerous. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Now the next slide is about inflammation. Now, inflammation is recognised as something which is essential to react to injury and infection, and also in cancer. You know, a lot of our cells become cancerous, but quite often our immune system deals with it and kills them off.
Is that macrophages?
Yeah, macrophages have a part to play in that, yes. Yeah. But also, you know, there's as you see on this slide, there's many different types of immune cells. There's mast cells, neutrophils, macrophages. There's also, you know, there's a whole host of them.
Right.
And these cells all have different functions, and they can all basically change their behaviour depending on the environment.
So in a normal circumstances, we produce cancer cells which are mocked up by lymphocytes.
Yeah. And also, if you have a wound, you know, these cells have a very important part to play in responding to the wound, destroying the dead tissue, laying down new fibre, you know, growing and repairing. But I'll move on to the next slide. In what is also becoming recognised is that something goes wrong with inflammation in the case of disease. You know, things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism, cancer, various different types of infections, autoimmune disease. Something's going wrong, and basically the inflammation, rather than being protective, becomes destructive, and it's not really understood the reason why. Yeah, and I'll take you through the story, and I can explain why through the presentation.
Okay. Next slide.
So the next slide is we raised the question: has a reductionist approach in medical research and treatment reached its limits? Now, despite all of the new techniques we've got, despite the understanding of the human genome, the rate of introduction of new drugs into the market has steadily declined since the mid-1980s. And this decline isn't due to lack of finance or lack of market. You know, budgets have increased since the 30-fold since the 1970s. So, you know, something's going wrong. And people will argue that it's, you know, it's more tight regulations and, you know, it's harder to do things, but actually I think it's more of the case that it's a lack of systems thinking. It's a silo approach. The way that people get their funding basically forces them to specialise more and more into discrete subjects, and as a result of that, people aren't thinking about the big system. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which explains about the puzzling role of transforming growth factor beta. So I'm a systems engineer. I'm not a medical researcher, and I came into this by accident when I was doing an Open University course. Strangely enough.
And I know transforming growth factor beta played a big part in that.
It did, yes.
In your thing, yeah. Is that a hormone?
It's you could sort of describe it as a hormone. It's an enzyme which is produced in the body, and it has important properties.
Signaling.
Yeah, it's a signaling molecule. Yeah, it's a hormone.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, in a healthy cell, transforming growth factor beta, as I mentioned earlier, inhibits cell growth and replication. Yeah.
Yep.
But in cancers, these cancerous cells learn to ignore transforming growth factor beta, and what happens is that the cancer starts to replicate faster than its neighbours, and what happens is that when a cancer starts to become malignant, it's ignoring that transforming growth factor beta.
Right.
But what is really puzzling is that when cancer starts to become malignant, they actually start to produce very high quantities of TGF-beta. And this is really strange because in the early stages of cancer, TGF-beta inhibits the cancers, but in the latter stages, it actually accelerates the malignancy, the growth and spread of the cancers. And when you look at what TGF-beta is actually doing, is it causes the growth of new blood vessels. It remodels the surrounding tissue. What it does is it makes it more mobile, makes it more plastic.
Yeah.
So it allows the cancer to spread into it. And what TGF-beta also does is, and this is really significant, is it actually suppresses the immune system. Yeah, so it helps to hide
in the higher quantities.
Yeah, it hides the cancer from the immune system. Yes.
Oh, right.
Yeah, allowing transforming growth factor beta basically helps the cancer to spread.
Yeah.
And I tried to work out why this was happening. So if we move on to the next slide. So where's the TGF-beta coming from? Now, when I was looking at the literature, it seemed that the importance of TGF-beta was certainly recognised, and current research was really focusing on, well, what is the genetic change which is making all this TGF-beta appear? But I wondered if perhaps it might be something different. Could the tumours be doing something else to cause the TGF-beta to be expressed?
Yeah.
Now, if you think about the cell diagrams that I showed earlier, cells have receptors on their surface, and when these receptors are triggered, they basically tell the DNA to manufacture certain chemicals. So I wondered if a receptor on the cell surface might be becoming apparent and then triggering the production of TGF-beta. And a literature research on PubMed suggested that the AT1 receptor might be key in the production of TGF-beta. I found this looking at papers in cardiovascular disease, so diseases of high blood pressure essentially.
Yeah.
And there seemed to be a very important relationship between AT1 and TGF-beta.
AT1?
AT1, yeah. That's the angiotensin 2 type 1 receptor.
Uh-huh.
It's a receptor which is classically associated with cardiovascular disease.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a drug. It's a target for drugs. There's drugs called angiotensin receptor blockers which block that receptor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's used very effectively in cardiovascular disease. Now, interestingly, abnormal AT1 expression had been noted in many cancers, but it hadn't been considered significant at the time.
No?
No. Now, systems thinking suggests that because the malignancy of tumours depends